Okay, something is not adding up, and this time it's not just whispers behind palace doors. It's paper trails, timelines, and a story that feels like it's cracking right in front of us. Because what if the woman the world thinks it knows isn't who she says she is at all? What if the age, the past, even the identity we've been sold for years was carefully constructed, piece by piece, until it looked perfect? And now someone has started pulling at the threads. Because when Tom Bauer steps in, this isn't gossip anymore. This is dissection. This is someone who doesn't deal in rumors, but in documents, archives, and details so small, they usually go unnoticed unless you're looking for something bigger. And suddenly, all eyes are on Meghan Markle, not for what she said, but for what might not be true. It begins quietly, too quietly. A magazine, March 1997, page 90, a simple feature in 17 magazine listing Meghan Markle as 21 years old. Now pause. Think. If the official story is correct, if she was born in 1981, then in March 1997, she should have been just 15, maybe 16, not 21. That's not a small mistake. That's not a typo you brush off. That is a 6-year gap sitting in black and white ink, untouched for decades, unnoticed until now. And the question hits instantly. How does something like that exist unless someone somewhere gave that number? And this is where it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern, because the magazine wasn't alone. The trail doesn't stop there, it deepens. IMDb, the very database casting directors rely on, once listed her birth year as 1977, not 1981, 1977. A completely different story quietly sitting in the background while the public believed something else. And then suddenly it changes. The 1977 disappears, replaced, cleaned, adjusted, like it was never there. But according to Bauer, the screenshots exist, the receipts exist. And now the question gets louder. Why would two completely separate records point to an older age unless there was something to hide? Because in Hollywood, age isn't just a number. It's everything. It decides whether doors open or slam shut forever. It decides whether you're the lead or the background. And if you're aging out of the system, you don't just lose roles, you disappear. So if someone needed to stay relevant, needed to stay in the game just a little longer, wouldn't shaving a few years off make perfect sense? And suddenly, what once seemed harmless starts looking strategic. But then comes the part that makes everything feel uncomfortable. Northwestern University. The timeline that should have been solid. Graduation in 2003, age 22. Perfect, clean, believable. Except when Bauer starts digging into classmates, photos, alumni lists, something feels off. The people around her, the ones in her clubs, her social circles, her own group photos, they weren't early 80s births. They were early 70s. Entire clusters of people born nearly a decade earlier, and she fits right in. Not as the younger one trying to keep up, but as someone completely at ease. And when asked directly, those who were there didn't hesitate. Early 70s, they said, again and again. Consistent, almost too consistent. And then one voice, quiet but cutting, drops a line that changes everything. We all knew she was older than she claimed. Not a rumor, not speculation, an open secret. The kind people ignore until suddenly they can't anymore. And now the story isn't just about numbers, it's about memory. It's about lived experience. Because timelines on paper can be edited, but people remember what they lived through. And then something even stranger, the family. Because when Bauer turns to her father, this should have been the easiest part. The simplest question: what year was your daughter born? A father knows that instantly, without hesitation. But that's not what happens. There's a pause, a silence, and then a response that doesn't answer anything at all. You should check the records yourself. Read that again. Not a confirmation, not a correction, a deflection. And suddenly that silence feels heavier than any answer he could have given. Because what father doesn't know or won't say the year his child was born? That's not normal. That's not forgetfulness. That feels like hesitation, like knowing something and choosing not to say it out loud. And just when you think it couldn't get more unsettling, it does. Because her half-sister adds another layer, another crack. According to the official story, there's a 17-year gap between them. Different generations, different childhoods, but that's not how she remembers it. She says they were closer, much closer. And if that's true, then the math doesn't work. Because if Meghan were actually born years earlier, suddenly everything aligns. The memories make sense. The closeness fits. The timeline stops fighting back. And now you're left staring at something that doesn't feel accidental anymore. It feels constructed. deconstruct it. Because when multiple pieces from magazines to databases to classmates to family start pointing in the same direction, you have to ask the question no one wants to say out loud. What if the story we've been told was never the real one to begin with? And just when it feels like the cracks couldn't spread any further, the story takes a turn that stops feeling like speculation and starts feeling like something much more controlled, much more deliberate. Almost like someone has been managing the paper trail itself. Because now the focus shifts from old records and fading memories to something official, something legal, something that should never raise questions in the first place, a birth certificate tied to her own child. And this is where everything tightens. When Archie was born in May 2019, the document was simple, clean, unquestionable. It listed the mother's name clearly, Rachel Meghan Markle, a full legal identity, the kind that connects every dot in a person's life, school records, contracts, history, everything. But then, quietly, without any loud announcement or public explanation, something changed. Weeks later, that same certificate was altered. The name disappeared, not adjusted, not corrected, removed, erased completely. And in its place, a title, Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex. No Rachel, no Meghan, no Markle, just a role, a position, a label that cannot be traced backward through ordinary records. And that's when the question becomes impossible to ignore. Why would someone remove their own legal name from their child's birth certificate? Because that's not cosmetic, that's not style, that is identity control, that is distancing the present from the past. And according to Tom Bower's interpretation, this is where fear enters the picture. Not fear of headlines, but fear of connection. Because names connect things. Names allow documents to be cross-checked, timelines to be verified, patterns to be exposed. And if those patterns don't hold up, then the entire structure starts to collapse. And this is where the conversation shifts from uncomfortable to dangerous. Because once you start questioning official information, once you start asking whether details on legal documents are accurate, you are no longer in gossip territory. You are stepping into legal consequences. Bower reportedly took these findings to experts, people who understand what happens when information doesn't match up under scrutiny. And the responses weren't casual. They were serious. Because if false information was ever provided on something as critical as a marriage document under British law, that doesn't just lead to embarrassment. It could lead to annulment. Not divorce, annulment. A legal erasure. A statement that the marriage, in the eyes of the law, was never valid to begin with. And let that sink in for a moment. Because that doesn't just affect two people. That ripples outward. Titles, agreements, contracts, everything tied to that union suddenly becomes unstable. It becomes questionable. It becomes something lawyers can pull apart piece by piece. And if any part of that structure was built on inaccurate information, then the consequences aren't emotional, they're financial, legal, systemic. And now suddenly, every deal, every partnership, every agreement built on a public identity comes into focus. Because brands don't just invest in people, they invest in stories. And if the story changes, or worse, if it falls apart under pressure, then those deals don't just weaken, they become liabilities. Contracts can be challenged. Payments can be disputed. Entire partnerships can be reevaluated. And for someone whose global image has been carefully crafted and monetized, that is not a small risk. That is everything. And yet, what's most striking in all of this isn't the claims. It isn't even the documents. It's the response, or rather, the lack of one. Because when these allegations surfaced, the reaction from Meghan's side wasn't a detailed breakdown, wasn't a document release, wasn't a direct refutation backed by evidence. It was a dismissal. Words like baseless, conspiracy, melodrama, strong language, yes, but not proof, not clarification, not the one thing that could shut everything down instantly, a clear, undeniable document confirming the timeline beyond question. And that absence starts to echo loudly, because in situations like this, silence isn't neutral. Silence becomes part of the story. It stretches, it lingers, it invites more questions than answers ever could. Because if everything is exactly as it's always been presented, then why not prove it? Why not end it in a single move? Why allow the narrative to spiral, to grow, to gain momentum when it could be stopped instantly with one piece of paper? Unless it can't be. And this is where timing starts to feel almost too perfect to ignore. Because all of this is unfolding at a moment when the larger structure surrounding Meghan and Harry appears to be shifting. The deals that once defined their post-royal identity, the streaming partnerships, the audio platforms, the high-profile projects have either slowed down or faded completely. The momentum that once felt unstoppable now feels uncertain. And when public perception begins to wobble at the same time as financial structures begin to thin out, the pressure multiplies. Because image isn't just reputation, it's currency. And when that currency starts losing stability, everything built on top of it feels the impact. And so now, the narrative that once felt polished and controlled begins to show strain, not through one dramatic reveal, but through a series of small, persistent inconsistencies that refuse to disappear. A magazine entry that doesn't match, a database that changed, classmates whose memories don't align, a father who hesitates, a sister whose timeline contradicts the official version, a legal document that was quietly altered. None of these pieces alone would be enough to create this level of tension. But together, they form something else entirely. A pattern, a rhythm, a sequence that keeps pointing in the same direction. Not definitive, not confirmed, but persistent. And that persistence is what makes this story feel like it's still moving, still evolving, still building towards something that hasn't fully surfaced yet. Because Tom Bower didn't present a single answer. He didn't say, here is the exact truth. Instead, he laid out fragments, clues, pieces that don't quite fit together unless you start considering a different version of events entirely. And that's what makes this so unsettling. Because the question isn't just what is true, the question is why so many different paths seem to lead away from the official story rather than toward it. Why every attempt to verify ends in contradiction instead of confirmation. Why the simplest question, what year was she born, has become the hardest one to answer clearly. And now everything hangs in that uncertainty. Because the truth, whatever it is, hasn't been fully revealed. Not yet. It's sitting somewhere behind documents that haven't been shown, behind answers that haven't been given, behind a silence that keeps stretching longer than it should. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all, because this doesn't feel finished. It feels like something that's just getting started.